30. Devotional Thoughts for Women, written by Monica Diaz, read by Belinda Sainsbury.
Good morning, dear friends. Today, April the 9th, our devotional is entitled Slave of a Slave. The man ordered to lead the slave to his punishment stretched out both his arms and fastened them to a piece of wood. Dionysius of Halicarnassus, 1st century BC. Sometimes I compare myself with Bible characters and I'm surprised to how different we are and the damage the culture in which I was raised has caused on the way I think. For instance, when I became an Adventist, it took me a long time to tell my friends and acquaintances that I had changed my denomination. I was afraid of rejection, prejudice, and what others would say about my new beliefs. I was ashamed of belonging to a movement that was unpopular back then in my home country of Spain, and more so after watching news on television about sex, in which Adventist church were often included. I didn't want anybody to view me as inferior to what they had thought of me up to then, and was convinced that they would do so if they found out. I closely guarded my new religious convictions so as not to be considered second rate. And I suddenly found myself faced with the Apostle Paul in the Bible, yelling from the rooftops that he was a servant of Christ Jesus. Romans 1:1. If being an Adventist was frowned upon 30 years ago in Spain, it must have been much more frowned upon in the first century to be a slave of a slave. And why do I say of a slave? Because the Roman penal system back then, crucifixion was reserved for slaves. Hence, why Seneca called it supplicium servile, the slave's torture. Being condemned to die on the cross revealed the criminal's social status. When someone heard Paul say, I and those who are Christians like me are slaves of a crucified man called Jesus, what they understood was that Christians were slaves of a slave. The Paul that wrote words as intense as these were on the completely opposite end as far as thought is concerned about where I was when I converted. He could have introduced himself as Paul, a Roman citizen, the great intellectual, but he preferred to do so as the slave of a slave. He didn't care about committing social suicide, of being branded as a second-class citizen, and with that attitude, he inspires courage in us. Do you care about social prejudice against religion? Do you avoid saying you are Christ follower? Do you try to avoid the subject whenever you are with people who don't believe the way you do? Imitate Paul just as he imitated Christ. 1 Corinthians 11:1. I did so, and now not only am I not ashamed to belong to this church, but actually find it delightful to speak about it because, inwardly, I think God will use that conversation to fulfill His purposes of salvation. For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. 1 Corinthians 1:18.